Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events, which we curate especially for the aspirants of the civil service examinations, with an emphasis on India's national interest, India's worldview, but at the same time keeping in mind how the events change the big power equations, how they impinge on international relations generally. And this time what we are going to discuss with you is a very interesting topic of the Democracy Summit organized by President Biden of the United States of America. The conflict between democracy and dictatorship is an old one in international relations. And if you go back to the Second World War, the war was fought ostensibly on the grounds of defending democracy. But the interesting part is this, that on the side of the Allied forces, there was also the then Soviet Union, which was not recognized as a democracy till the outbreak of the war by the rest of the world. So there is this extremely interesting contradictions of definition of democracy, a simplistic definition of democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, but varieties of democracies that exist. The history of democratic institutions that go back to centuries before the birth of Christ, the city-states in Greece, that's one part. So this binary between democracy and dictatorship, democracy and authoritarian rule, some would call it even dictatorship and tyranny on one side, and democracy and the freedoms on the other side. Democracy is equated with freedom, tyranny with the absence of freedom, and that's what President Biden's Democracy Summit seems to underline and emphasize once again. We shall discuss this and a lot more this time with you. To establish the context of Biden's Democratic Summit, we don't thankfully have to go back to centuries before the birth of Christ or even go back decades, 50, 60 years. The immediate historical context is good enough to examine the significance of this summit. President Biden, during his election campaign, had laid great emphasis on democratic values. He had criticized his opponent Trump for violation of democratic values, processes in America. And the climax of this was seen on the 6th January last year, when Trump made a claim, an outrageous claim, that the elections had been stolen from him, and he convinced some of his hardcore Republican Party supporters to launch an offensive and attack on Capitol Hill. And there was a touch-and-go situation where it appeared that the temple of democracy in America would be violated. It was violated in the sense that trespassers did manage to gain an entry. There were shots fired, some lives were lost, and this the legal challenge to what Trump did is continuing in the United States of America. That's one part. The second part was that even before this, the 5 years preceding when Biden was sworn into office, Trump had taken a series of decisions which violated the spirit of democracy. And some would say that even the letter of the Constitution was violated, because he thought that the president could do anything. The president could, regardless if he were not impeached. And in this case, he was impeached also, but he was not made to resign. He was not removed from office. So as long as the political system in the United States of America is a very peculiar one, where you have a Senate, where you have federating states, and you have this kind of thing, and you have a Supreme Court which intervenes at times, but advice and consent of the Senate and elected representatives in a presidential system mean very different from what we understand in a democracy in India or in England or elsewhere. And also there is a two-party system, and the voters do not get too great a choice to select their primaries, and there is an electoral college. Without getting into too complicated an analysis, description of the American electoral system, American political system, two-party system, the short point is this, that even during the presidency of Trump, the world was worried that how the American democratic system or the American democracy could be hijacked by a tyrannically inclined authoritarian president. And Trump was the worst nightmare come true. Go back another 4 or 5 years, and when President Obama had been elected, there were great hopes that he would bring about radical change about how big money influences American electoral system, how media is bought over by big money, and how media creates a narrative which sells a president or sells a party or sells a war and peace issue, and the American voters are gullible enough, despite their claims to being very fiercely independent and democratic. The phrase used was manufacturing consent, was a big time business, which Noam Chomsky said, and there were hidden persuaders in the advertising world. So the capitalistic system had a democratic model in America, which apparently was on surface very, very democratic, very, very free, but the free market forces seem to have hijacked the freedom of the electorate from them. So there was one part. So for the decade and a half, really, the Americans have been worried about this. The more disturbing factor about the American democracy itself has been, and let's not give you the impression that we are criticizing the American democracy. No democracy is perfect. All democracies are perfect, are flawed. They are probably works in progress. But the point is that if the President of the United States calls a democratic summit, invites people to it arbitrarily, leaves out some people, questions are likely and very natural to be raised. Why does America wants to impose its model of democracy when it has its own conduct in the past 10-15 years has not been very reassuring in the realm of democracy? So when Obama had come to power, he for a short while had given the promise that he might rebuild the system, but very soon he made some compromises to take Republicans with him. There are a variety of mysterious reasons never fathomed that why did Obama not continue his task into his 2 terms of office. So 2 terms of Obama, promise belied, 1 term of Trump, pretty traumatic, and then the beginning of Biden's rule is one part. Over this, since the turn of the century, when America suffered the attack on the World Trade Towers in 9/11, there has been this problem that America has tried to propound a doctrine of regime change, and which is to say that countries which are authoritarian, countries which are tyrannical, countries which harbor terrorists should be changed into democracies, because there is a belief, maybe mistaken, that democracies don't fight each other, and democracies fight the forces of tyranny and authoritarianism together. So this is it. But at the height of the crisis, when the Trump claimed that election had been stolen from him, it also became obvious to the world that America was a nation divided almost midway, straight down the middle, between those who were evangelists, those who were advocating white supremacy, those who were patriarchal, those who were treating people of color as second-class citizens, people who thought that the right to bear arms was a fundamental right, and the concept of individual liberty and privacy dating back to American Revolution and then the Civil War and the fractures in the nation continue to haunt United States of America. So this imposition of American democracy from top has been not acceptable to the world at large. Not even the American model of democracy has been generally accepted. So this is one part. Now we can proceed to what Biden was seeking to do. Biden was trying to say that the forces of authoritarianism in Russia and China are becoming a threat to democracies everywhere else. Now, for this purpose, democracy was defined very simply: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and also tolerance of different faiths, etc., and not violation of human rights, particularly of your own citizens, not trying to interfere in neighborhood's internal affairs. Now, if this is the limited form of democracy, and the demonization of Russia under Putin and China under Xi had 2 critical points: that A, China was trying to practice genocide in Xinjiang against Uyghur Muslims, China was trying to forcibly annex Taiwan, and China had violated the commitment given about Hong Kong in trying to reclaim Hong Kong and changing the political system there totally. Earlier, of course, China was accused of similar actions in Tibet, but the world had given support to Tibetan rebels morally, but not much more than that. About Russia also, the demonization is that the Russians have been trying to annex Ukraine, they have annexed Crimea, and they are trying to restore the relationship with their erstwhile republics, which they had done earlier. Putin's interference in Middle East, in Syria and Iraq and Libya, has not been looked upon with very great favor by the Western countries. Partly, these allegations may be true. But what we should not forget is that when we say that these two demons, these two outlaws who don't live by the rule of law, who don't respect the international law, the Americans don't seem to realize that they are practicing double standards, are going back on their own words. Biden himself has accepted the one China policy. So if America, United States of America, has always accepted the one China policy, you cannot say that People's Republic of China is trying to annex Taiwan, an independent country. The Security Council seat as a permanent member is the People's Republic of China. Taiwan is supposed to be part of a breakaway group in 1949 when Kuomintang leaders took shelter there as an integral part of China. So if Americans accept the one China policy, they cannot say China is annexing another country in Taiwan. More or less the same applies to Russia and Ukraine. If Ukraine is a core of the identity of Russian identity, and if there have been provocative actions on the part of NATO and Europeans and the Americans to wean away Ukraine from Russia and to deploy forces there, I think this claim that these two countries are not democratic and the rest of the world is democratic is a little too rich to concede the argument. The interesting part is this, that we'll leave Russia and China apart because, of course, one could very easily argue that neither Russia is, by a long stretch of imagination, a totally democratic country, nor can you say that the single-party domination of the Communist Party in China allows its claim to be sustained, that it is a democratic country. Nor can it be sustained that they have not been violating human rights, freedom of expression has been curbed, etc. But let's have a look at the guest list, which Biden sent out. He sent out a list to 12 nations in the world, which would mean that it was more than half the members of the United Nations. But look at the list of the countries. Most of the countries are microscopic mini states in the Pacific region: Tonga, Samoa, Papua and New Guinea. These small islands. It's highly Eurocentric and Christian white world, Western world. There are about majority of the countries belong to Europe, they belong to United States, Canada, and smaller countries in the Latin American continent. Major countries, of the major countries' democracies, India probably was the only one which was outside this. And there again also are very interesting invitees. India was invited, and India would claim to be the largest democracy in the world. Although Americans themselves have been criticizing the decline or sliding back of democratic institutions and processes in India, but we'll come to that a little later. But with India, Pakistan was invited. Now, this is crazy because when the president of the Freedom House, which has often been criticizing India, the state of Indian democracy, was asked, he said, Americans have geopolitical compulsions. If India is invited, how can they keep Pakistan out? Now, Pakistan, which has been a military dictatorship, elected government or no elected government for decades, ever since almost its birth, how can that be claimed as a democracy at par with India? Now, interestingly, Nepal was invited, but with India, but Bangladesh was not invited. And not only that, Bangladesh was criticized vehemently, and selective sanctions against its border guards, its militia were also enforced. Now, this defining who is democratic and who is not democratic on the grounds, if Pakistan was democratic, Bangladesh should have qualified for that. Of course, there were other countries which were kept out, like Singapore, which is a one-party domination. Fair enough, small enough country. But when it came to America's partners, you had Israel. Now, Israel's behavior as a democratic country is highly suspect. The way it has been treating Palestinians or the Arabs living within the territory, or violating the rights of the Arabs residing in Palestinian area under Palestinian authorities' control, doesn't make it look remotely like a democratic country. You also had countries like Brazil, where Bolsonaro's record is disgusting. Now, you see, you could not have possibly a whole united front of countries. Taiwan was, of course, invited, but this was just to spite the Chinese. So you invited Poland, but you kept out Hungary. So it was very, very selective list, arbitrarily taken. And I think the president of the Freedom House did make a point that Americans drew the bottom line at their geopolitical interests. They were trying to do something. There are some defenders of the American position. There are major think tanks like Brookings or Carnegie or the group which looks after foreign policy. They came out with the argument that, all right, the American president was at least recognizing the flaws and weaknesses of the American democracy, so he can't be blamed for that. And he was trying to, work realistically and not turn a blind eye to geopolitical realities. But the interesting part is this, that how India went there, and India was very happy to be invited. The Prime Minister made a very, very interesting and some would say boastful statement saying that India is the mother of all democracy in the world, because Indian democratic institutions and republican institutions date back to even earlier than Greek city-states. But the point is that what is the state of Indian democracy today? Americans couldn't keep India out despite criticizing the violation of human rights, the erosion of democratic institutions, restrictions on freedom of expression, etc. American think tanks, American government, American senators have all criticized this rather harshly. But they could not disregard, again for the same geopolitical reasons, that India is the second largest populated country in the world. So if China was being kept out and if India was not invited, the Americans would have a very, very hollow summit. So the American need for having the Indian democracy, however imperfect, however illiberal, however distorted, they had to have India on their side. This creates a problem for India and the neighborhood on India's relationship with Russia and China, which we shall examine a little later. But right now, what happened is that in the second week, a 2-day spilling over to the third day summit was held, and Biden said that another summit would be organized by the end of the year and when the stock taking would take place. Now, this is one part of the summit about that. Now, what were the focus? What were the statements made? The French were not too enthusiastic about the summit. President Macron did send a message, but made it very clear that the democracy summit should not appear as an anti-Chinese, anti-Russian ganging up of the Western capitalist nations. We also must keep in mind that how much Europe depends on the gas for its energy security coming from Russia, and how much does the European countries depend on the infrastructural development, not financial assistance, but technological integration of the Chinese telecommunications into their economic developmental plans. They also, whether it is France or Germany, they also want to indicate to the world that they are no less a democracy than the United States of America. They have their own democratic models, and they also want to follow a line in foreign policy and international relations which is autonomous. Once you keep all these things in mind, you realize that the limits of the Democracy Summit were quite obvious. What some people have been bothered about even more is that is it the declaration of a new Cold War? Now, throughout the Cold War, when the Cold War was fought in the middle of the 20th century, the argument was it was the free world. It was the democracies of the West who were trying to keep away the menace of a totalitarian communism, and that is what was the defense of the free world was. That's where the Iron Curtain line was drawn. That is where the domino doctrine, that if one domino falls, the rest will fall down, was there, and all the military alliance systems were built to contain. The doctrine of containment was to keep Russia isolated, and till China was in the same block, keep China isolated. Now, when there was a thaw, different words were used. In the 1970s, 80s, when it was either called détente, it was called rapprochement, it was called normalization of relationship, reduction of tensions. And when the Americans had a rapprochement with Russia, when the Americans had a normalization of relationship in the decade of 1970s with China, it appeared that the Cold War was over. Although some analysts in international relations have been talking of a new Cold War, a second Cold War, or regional Cold Wars being fought, but that apart, the principal powers, the major powers, the two superpowers, America and Soviet Union, then its successor state Russia and China, had some kind of a modus vivendi that they would not confront each other or fight directly. So the people thought that the era of Cold War was over. But now it seems there is a new frostiness in the relationship between United States of America and Russia, and also very uneasy, tense relationship between United States and China. Some people have tried to link it with America's humiliating retreat from Afghanistan. When America retreated from Afghanistan, it knew that it was not going to play a very significant role in whatever was happening in South Asia or in Central Asia, to a certain extent even in West Asia, after the normalization of relationship more or less between Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the resurrection of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Americans also had formed first quads, then AUKUS, to see that the responsibility of guarding and policing the sea lanes in South China Sea and Indian Ocean, even in the Indo-Pacific area, would be left to a coalition of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, out of, which Japan also was ultimately on the fringes. It was Australia, New Zealand, United States, and United Kingdom, which would the old Anglophone world would take off this charge. So what would Americans do? Then the Americans thought that they had now time to focus on the primary relationship between United States of America, Russia, and China. We will see where does India fit in this new power play, and whether it is really the beginning of a new Cold War, or it is just being hyped to give an summit a significance which it doesn't really have. It is just a symbolic gesture which Biden is making to distract his electorate from criticizing him on his failures on the economic front, failures to persuade the Senate without a compromise, or bring about any radical reforms in the American system. Whether it is the arms, the right to bear arms, whether it is Me Too, whether it is the mistreatment of the people of color. So all this remains as blemishes, negative marks on American democracy. It reduces America's credibility as a leader of a democratic campaign against tyranny. And how you define democracy and tyranny is a matter of where you stand and what your perspective is. We shall discuss this in the next section. The Russians and the Chinese have reacted predictably to the democracy summit. The Chinese called it a joke, they called it a sinister conspiracy, and Putin made remarks which made it very clear that he considers this summit beneath contempt. They had a summit. Biden had a summit with Putin. Pleasantries were exchanged, but no substantial progress was made, either about Ukraine, where the red lines were clearly drawn, nor had Putin made any commitment. Now, interestingly, the Chinese already are facing another new kind of a boycott, the diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics there. Now, this is a boycott which is extremely hypocritical. Going back again to the president of the Freedom House, he said sports are sports and politics should not mingle. But the point is that in past, whether it is the Russians or the Americans, whether it is the Moscow Olympics or the Los Angeles Olympics, there has been intrusion of politics, and each superpower then at the height of the Cold War had kept out of it. So you cannot say that there is any arena of human life in international affairs which is not politics. Gold medals are used as propaganda for a superiority of one system versus the other system. When one sports person seeks refuge in another country, it again is a criticism of a closed society or a society which is oppressive. So this game is played both ways, to mix metaphors. But the interesting part is what the Americans have announced is that we shall not interfere with the sports persons who have prepared hard for the Winter Olympics, but we shall not recognize the Olympics, and our diplomatic contingent would not go. So diplomats would boycott the Olympics, but the sportsmen will not do so. This almost reminds us of the Olympics in Tokyo recently, where the Russians were banned for drug abuse. The Russian team did not participate under the Russian flag, but they did participate under the flag of the Russian Olympic Association. Russian anthem was not played. The anthem song of the Russian Olympic Association was played. So this, I think, are the kind of compromises which a big power makes to keep intact this channel of communication to the other one. But let's return to Russia and China. What they reacted by doing that is that the Putin and Xi had a high-level summit meeting of their own. They were not organizing a democratic summit of hundreds of people. They were just talking among themselves, but they made it very clear and they conveyed to the rest of the world that the two were close together for a variety of reasons. The Russians are now worried that if there is a ganging up against the Russians, they might lose sooner rather than later the European market for their gas and energy supplies. Because if there is a building momentum about clean energy, ban on fossil fuels, for temporarily they still might have the door slightly ajar to go to Germany, go to France, supply to Europe, bypass Ukraine. But in long run, they will have to look for alternative markets. And what is a better market than China next door? China, for its rapid economic developments, is dependent on energy supplies, and it has no compunctions about using fossil fuels. Interestingly, India also is on the same page with China as far as fossil fuels are concerned. India and China both had registered their protest at the Glasgow summit after the Conference of Parties 26 summit, that they should be given a little more respite to rebuild their economies and undo the historic damage which they've done in the period of colonialism, to use their fossil fuel, and they will slowly reduce their consumption. Here the problem is the Russians do realize that even if there is no immediate ban on fossil fuels, the Americans and the Western world would like to rely more and more on the supplies from their reliable friends in the Middle East, even the gas supplies from Kuwait or Qatar, or oil supplies from Saudi Arabia. So they would have to prepare for a day when they are going to lose out on the European market. The Russians have lived with severe economic sanctions, so have the Chinese. The Russians have learned to live without any economic interaction with the West. So I think it's been argued by various political scientists even in the West, economic sanctions don't make much sense. Whether it is Iran, whether it is Russia, whether it is China, the country against whom economic sanctions are used over a period of time seems to learn to live without this relationship and look for alternative markets and alternative ways of economic development. This is exactly what is happening, and Russia, adjacent to China, has a wonderful market and a reliable friend. Also, like you could say that there is affinity, as Kant said, the democracies don't fight, they live together happily. You could also say that tyrannies and authoritarian regimes coexist fairly happily. So if there is a growing authoritarian trend in Russia, and there is a growing authoritarian trend in China under Xi and Russia under Putin, the two also would not have the kind of differences they once had when Russia was normalizing its relationship, Thor, rapprochement, Détente, call it whatever you may, in the mid-20th centuries, late 60s, late 70s with America, till China had made up its mind to normalize relations in Mao's last days with America. But then, even then, the temper didn't change entirely. The Chinese may have opened up their economy, liberalization during the Deng Xiaoping's days, but political liberalization did not come, as the Tiananmen Square showed very clearly. So the problem is that as far as the West talks of authoritarian regimes who do not believe in rule-based system, both China and Russia have a flawless argument against America, that is America that does not live by the rule-based system. There are two levels at which this argument is carried on. One is that the rule-based system which America and the West talks about was evolved by the West, to which neither Russia nor China played any role in evolution of international legal system and so on. But once they have joined even partially this, they have abided by the rules. It is only the Americans who flaunt their power, and they say that they are not bound by any treaties or a piece of paper. That is what actually ex-President Bush had said when World Trade Towers were attacked, that no piece of paper would be allowed to interfere with homeland security. So when it comes to their soldiers fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere, they cannot be brought to book in a court of crimes tribunal or for the violation of human rights, and other partners of Americans have also tried to have an extended claim. So whether it is Australian soldiers fighting in Afghanistan or whether it is the French foreign legionnaires fighting in Sahel region. So this obvious double standards is not acceptable either to Russia or to China. So they again argue that we have democracies of our own. Who are you to decide whether the rulers represent the will of our own people, or their will should be expressed in a manner which you decide according to your systems? Why do you want to talk about freedom of media when your media is used primarily to protect the interest of big business? So this conflict of interest between big business, media, big money spent in elections in Western democracies, and the political parties is a problem which is likely to remain. This brings us to a very interesting situation. How does India respond to this, shall we say, footsteps, however mild at the moment, of an approaching Cold War? India has chosen to participate in the Democratic Summit, sort of defend its own democratic record very ably. But the point is, how long can it manage to do so? Its relationship with Russia is important, especially since under the American influence, India had cut down its oil imports from Iran. It had underplayed its age-old cultural ties with Iran, the largest Shia nation in the world, and the second largest Shia population is in India. We have tried to reduce our dependence on our trade with China, but even at the height of the COVID crisis, in the last quarter, 26% of our trade has expanded, and so has our trade imbalance against China. Now, it is open to question that when the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister and the Home Minister shout themselves hoarse saying that we should not be dependent on China, but this kind of a dependence is that where we can say we will not be dependent in sensitive security areas, but itself, if the trade expands to this size, it itself creates a strategic problem. So India would not be openly criticizing the Russian criticism of the Democratic Summit. Absolutely. Very recently, Putin visited on a high-level visit to India. These visits we shall examine Indo-Russian relations in greater detail at length some other time. But what is important is that for India, which is trying to rebuild its relationship post-America's withdrawal from Afghanistan and leaving India in the lurch by forming AUKUS after it had been persuaded to join Quads, should give India scope for rethinking and thinking in terms of democracy as it operates within its borders, and not be vulnerable to exposure of any of these charges: violation of the rights of minorities, violation of human rights, freedom of expression being restricted, judiciary not being allowed to function free and fairly, other institutions like the Election Commission being exposed to the charge of not being kept at an arm's length with the executive wing. All these, and the draconian laws or the Special Armed Forces Special Powers Act. India has much to worry about the state of democracy today in the land, rather than congratulate itself and glorify the democratic past of India, which is much too distant. So it is not for Americans to say that Indian democracy is flawed, it is illiberal, it is dynastic, or whatever it is. But it is for India to say that, look, as long as democracy is healthy and flourishing in our own land, we don't have to worry about whether we are invited or not invited, whether we are ranked by Freedom House or some other institution or not. But nor can we say, like Russia and China, that we are a world unto ourselves. We will live as we are, and we don't give a damn to what the Westerners think about us or our democracy. India at the moment is neither China nor Russia. It is very close to a very different kind of a power, which comes right after the three major powers: America, Russia, and China. But then the gap between India's economy, gap between India's military muscle, the genuineness of the charges that the Indian democracy has been sliding back, and the lack of accelerated economic progress makes the road ahead a little more complicated for India. That is all we have for you this time. We shall take up another topic with you when we meet again. Till then, thank you and goodbye.